Oh, I've got the clicker, so I'll try and remember to click. So today is the last in our series on 1 Samuel. And as you'll have already picked up from the reading, we do sort of shift tone a little bit in the passage today. Up until this point, the focus has mostly been on Samuel and the early days of his life and his ministry. But in the chapter we're going to look at today, the author moves focus to an account of the battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. And this might seem like a really big shift from where we began, right? I'll admit, when I saw the preaching schedule, I was like, oh, great, I got this weird bit. But I'm hopefully going to demonstrate today that there's a clear through line from where our story began with Hannah and where it ends at the close of chapter 5. But before we get there, I want to kind of quickly recap the events of the book so far. Our story began with Hannah, a woman who believed herself to be infertile and who was grieving her perceived inability to have children. She comes before God in total anguish and prays to God for a baby. And her prayers are answered in the form of her son Samuel. She takes Samuel to the temple when he's still very young and says that she gives him to the Lord. She's so grateful that God heard her prayer that she willingly returns him to serve God. And in chapter 2, we hear this amazing prayer of thanksgiving as she praises God for all he has done. We then hear how Samuel grows up and is mentored by the priest Eli, whose own sons were wicked and corrupt. Eli fails to properly rebuke or challenge his sons, and because of this, God tells Eli that he will cut off the strength of his house and that both of his sons will die on the same day. And we'll come back to that bit. God then comes to Samuel to call him and raise him up as leader of the Israelites. Which brings us to the bit of the story we're going to focus on today, the battle with the Philistines. This is a very dramatic tale of battles and death and tumors. It seems like endless tumors in that passage. And I know that's not what everyone wants to hear on a Sunday morning, but please stick with me. I think it's worth the recap. In case this is all new to you, let's establish who these people were. The Philistines are like the ultimate bad guys to the Israelites at this point. And although the term Philistine now sort of refers to someone who's kind of uncultured or lacking in sophistication, the Philistines at this point were actually quite technologically advanced. They were formidable opponents. They were skilled ironmongers, which meant that while the Israelites relied on bronze, the Philistines were building much stronger weapons. In terms of this particular battle, it begins right up at the top, right up there. The Israelites are camped at Ebenezer, which you can see where the red arrow is pointing, while the Philistines are in Aphek, which is the north of their territory. And they then begin to cross over the border, and this is when the battle begins. The first round of fighting is a crushing defeat for the Israelites, and they lose 4,000 men. They're absolutely desperate, and they decide that the best way to secure an overall victory is to have the Ark of the Covenant brought over from Shiloh. And it's brought over by Eli's two sons who were mentioned earlier. Now, maybe you're thinking, what on earth is the Ark of the Covenant? Well, that's a fair question. It looks something like this. The process of building the Ark is detailed in the later chapters of Exodus, so that's some fun Sunday afternoon reading for you, if you really want to. God gave Moses instructions on the dimensions and features of the Ark, and it is used to house the tablets on which the 10 Commandments are written. It's believed to have looked a little bit like that. And the ark had traveled with the Israelites through the wilderness. And it's a really important symbol to them of the covenant between God and the Israelites. So they bring this ark to the next round of fighting. And not only are they once again defeated in battle, the Philistines also capture the ark. There are many more casualties in this battle, including the two sons of Eli, fulfilling the promise that they would die on the same day. And when Eli hears the news that the ark has been captured, he's described as falling backwards off his chair and breaking his neck. This is quite a grim part of the Bible, but I do find a little bit of humor in this verse, right? Because the writer felt the need to specify that Eli died not just because he was old, but also because he was heavy. And they really hammered that home. He's old and heavy. And that did really make me laugh when I was preparing for today. But anyway, back to the point. The Israelites are totally distraught. And the chapter ends with Eli's daughter-in-law giving birth to a baby, and she actually dies in childbirth. But before she does, she names him Ichabod, which literally means no glory, or the glory has departed. And she says she's named him this because the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of the battle that led us to where Dave read from today. And in that passage, the Philistines have taken the ark back to their stronghold in Ashdod, where they place it at the temple of Dagon. Now, Dagon was one of three main gods that the Philistines worshipped. And there are kind of conflicting theories about this god. So some people claim that he's like this picture on the left here, that he's this sort of half fish, almost like a mermaid kind of looking thing. I am no expert, but from what I read, it seems less likely to me than that he's actually, it's more likely that he's named after the Hebrew word for grain. And initially he was associated with sort of plentiful harvest, and then laterally with just sort of general prosperity. But either way, he was a really important figure to the Philistines. But as we hear in this passage, the statue of Dagon was toppled not once but twice by God. And the second time, God chops off both his head and his hands. These two chapters of ancient war feel almost like something out of like Game of Thrones or something. And I think sometimes it can feel quite detached from our relationships with God. It's like, what does this actually mean for us? But there are a few things that I want to pull out for us this morning. Firstly, when we get to the end of the battle, the first battle, when we get to the end of the second battle, the Israelites are in total despair at the loss of the ark, right? This had been their most prized possession. It has huge symbolic value to them, and they've lost it to their worst enemies, and that's devastating. But the Israelites brought that upon themselves. God did not command that the ark be brought into battle that day. He didn't tell them that it would bring them strength or have them win the battle. They decided this course of action. They took this precious object and they put it on the line, and they lost. They brought it upon themselves. And I'm not saying that every time something bad happens to us, it's our own fault. There are many times when we fall on hard times or we experience a devastating loss, and nothing we could have done or said would have prevented it. But that isn't what happened here. Here, the Israelites set themselves up to fail because they gambled something that was worth too much to lose. And maybe that's something you can relate to. Maybe you've done that in your own life and paid the price. When we have something valuable, we need to hold on to it. And the thing is that when the Israelites brought that ark into battle, I think they kind of cheapened it. They were treating it like this ultimate good luck charm. If we bring this thing with us, it means God's on our side. And ironically, when they brought that ark into battle, it became a symbol not of faith, but of doubt and fear. They didn't trust that God was already on their side. And these were God's chosen people. They're people whose ancestors had been brought out of slavery in Egypt, who had seen God bring plagues and part seas and guide them through the wilderness. They knew that God could do the unimaginable. But they lost that first battle, and they panicked, and they decided they needed something more to help them. The ark would never have been there for the taking had the Israelites trusted in God to see them through this battle. Which leads us to the next point. The ark was never God, right? That sounds obvious, but the ark was never God. It was a symbol of their relationship with him. But the Israelites slipped into something that is only too easy to do. They put their faith in a symbol rather than the actual relationship it represents. And I really do think that's something we struggle with today. We might not build an ark, but we find other ways to try and contain the power of God. You see, when the Israelites built that ark, it was intended to house the 10 Commandments. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. And this wasn't a false idol in the way that the Philistines were worshipping Dagon or their other fake gods, but it was an object that they had elevated to a position it was never meant to have. And you can see that when they respond with such terror at the loss of it. Eli hears that his 2 sons are dead, but it's the loss of the ark that kills him. And now, if we dig into semantics here, you could argue that they're worried about the anger or the wrath of God for having lost the ark rather than the ark itself. And that when Eli's daughter-in-law says the glory of God has departed, she's preempting this as a response to the loss of the ark rather than claiming it about the ark itself. But I think it's clear that the relationship to the ark has become more complex than that because of the fact they brought it into battle in the first place. When they did that, I think it shows that they've forgotten the ark was built to reflect, not house, the glory of God. I'm not going to talk about this on a personal level, but let's zoom out a bit and think about what that means for our churches. Because I sometimes think the institution of the church can become a bit like the Ark of the Covenant. I'm going to try very hard not to get on my soapbox here, but I'm sure you can imagine that in my job, if I don't know you, I should actually explain. I am the pioneer ministry leader here at Aberfeldy, and that means that a lot of my time is spent thinking about new ways of doing church. So I spend a lot of time talking about what works in church and what doesn't. I spend most of my week thinking and strategizing about how we grow this church here in Aberfeldy and how that also fits into our situation nationally as well. And I have a role on a national level on the Mission Support Programme Group, which is a committee that leads on overall strategies about church growth and mission. So I'm really, really steeped in this conversation, both within the Church of Scotland and with other denominations as well. And I'm sometimes struck with how boldly we all decide where God is at work and where he isn't. How often we make claims about churches that are dying and churches that are alive, and how often those claims are rooted in our own limited perceptions of success. And I'll be honest, I'm not immune to that. As part of my job, I have numerical targets around church growth that says this number would be a good number and that number would be disappointing. Back in March, when we were launching Christianity 101, I kept finding myself saying, I just hope we get a good number. And I felt really convicted on that when I was reading this passage, because I don't think we should skip over the fact that Dagon was the Philistines' god of prosperity. Where are we seeking prosperity when we should be seeking God? And if we extend that out, it also exists in the infighting amongst Christians too. There are whole groups of Christians that will tell you that other groups aren't doing it right, that they are not biblical and we are. And will tell you that God doesn't bless that work, he blesses this work. You've got people who will say only one type of music is the right type of music. That's worship music, that isn't. You can only experience the Holy Spirit there. Or you'll have people who say there shouldn't be music at all. That's the right way of doing worship. You'll have folk who will say that because I'm standing up here as a woman, this whole thing's actually null and void and we can all just go home. I could go on and on and on of all the stuff we argue about, all the boxes we try to contain God within. And seriously, who do we think we are? There's a bit of me when I read that passage in 1 Samuel where they talk about the glory departing from Israel, and I want to say, how dare you? How dare you think you get to decide where God's glory has gone? Because it becomes very clear in chapter 5 that God's glory is alive and well and at work right in the heartland of the enemies who captured the ark. He topples their God, he cuts off their God's head and hands. The glory of God is just fine, thank you very much. It's just working differently to the way that we thought it would, or the way we wanted it to. We try to contain God in our little boxes and claim him for our own causes. We decide that he's working in some places and not on others based on criteria we made for ourselves. We miss the point that God is not glorified through the existence of our church. Our churches exist because God's glory is and always was there to begin with. Our churches should reflect the glory of God and never try and house it. We need to be reminded of something that the Israelites had forgotten. The victory was always in God's hands. And this is the thread that binds together the story of the Israelites and the ark with the story of Samuel and Hannah. The victory is always in God's hands. Hannah's womb was described as having been closed by the Lord. But when he was ready and in his perfect timing, he opens it and allowed her to carry not just Samuel, but several children. He claims victory. Eli had been this inspiring figure who provided mentorship and spiritual guidance to the Israelites, but he couldn't keep his own kids in line. His family was a mess, and his weakness in dealing with that mess brought shame on his entire lineage. But in the midst of that sin and corruption and dishonesty, God still claims victory. He raises up a leader in Samuel. And as we read today, the ark is captured, all hope is gone, and God still claims victory. The Philistines put him in the center of the shrine to their God, and he still wins. And if we keep following that thread, and we think about the thing that connects you and me and this church to the Israelites, it's Jesus. Because not only can God defeat any army, any illness, any sin, he can literally defeat death itself, and he did it on the cross. And we still worry about presbytery mission planning. The victory is always on his terms, and it is always in his hands. We are children of a God who cannot lose and who will not fail. Why is it so hard for us and the Israelites to live in that truth? The final thought I want to leave you with is more of a question than anything else, because I'm honestly not sure that I would ever be able to unpack this in a sermon. But as I was preparing today, it struck me that I think a lot of the impulse to try and contain God is because we want him to fit into our own comprehension. Our human minds can hardly wrap their head around the extent of God's power. We so often use that phrase, the glory of God, but I want you to leave you today with the question of what that actually means. What does God's glory look like? Where have you seen it at work in your life? And if you're not sure, if you're sitting there thinking, I don't think I've ever seen the glory of God, or I actually don't even know that I think any of this is right or real, or I'm not really sure, I would really love to pray for you today. I'm going to pray for us all in a wee minute, but I'd be happy to pray for you individually, and the prayer team will also be at the back. And if you've never been to the prayer team before, do feel free to go up the back and speak to them. And if you'd rather speak to them in private, they'd be happy to go into the prayer room with you as well, if you'd prefer that. They will pray for literally anything. You can tell them as little or as much as you like. They don't need all the gory details. They're happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about. They can pray for something that's come up today around the glory of God, or this idea that God always wins, or they can pray for something else that has happened in your week. And yeah, I'm happy to pray. They're happy to pray. Please do come and take advantage of that. But let me pray for us